Welcome to episode 78 of Lucretius Today. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. For anyone who is not familiar with our podcast, please visit EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a complete description of our goals and our ground rules. If you have any questions about those, please be sure to contact us at the forum for more information. In this episode 78, our goal was to read approximately Latin lines 1105 through 1240 of Book 5. But due to the important ethical implications and interest of the subject, we covered only a small part of that in the discussion. So today we'll break well short of the material that we actually read, and we'll come back next week to tackle the part we don't get to today. Now let's join Martin reading today's text.
But if men would govern their lives by the rule of true reason, to live upon a little with an even mind would be the greatest riches. This little no man can fear to want, but men strive to be renowned and powerful, that their fortune may stand firm upon a lasting foundation, and the wealthy cannot fail to live at ease. All absurd, for those who labor to reach the highest honors make a very unhappy journey in the end. Envy, like a thunderbolt, strikes them from the pinnacle of their glory and tumbles them down with scorn into an abyss of misery, so that it is much safer as a subject to obey than to wish for empire and to govern kingdoms. Let those that will tire themselves in vain and spend their blood and their sweat in climbing the narrow track of ambition, for the highest of them all are blasted with envy, as with a thunderbolt. And the higher they are the more exposed, since they depend wholly upon others for their wisdom and try things more by their ears than by their understanding. This is the present case. It always was so, and ever will be. Those kings being slain, the former majesty of their thrones and their proud scepters were laid in the dust, and the diadem, the noble ornament of kings all stained with blood, is not trodden by vulgar feet, and weeps over its expiring honors. For we eagerly spurn at what we too much feared before. The government now returned to the rebel, and the very dregs of the people, whilst everyone reached the empire and the supreme power for himself. And therefore the wisest among them taught the rest to settle a magistracy, and to establish laws, by which they could be governed. Men grew weary of living in a state of force, and were worn out with continual bickering among themselves, and therefore of their own accord more readily fell under the power of laws and the bonds of justice. For everyone in his resentment pursued his revenge with more violence than the equity of the laws would now allow him. And therefore men were tired of this hostile way, which soured all their pleasures of life with the fears of punishment. For force and wrong entangle the man that uses them, and commonly recoil upon the head that contrives them. Nor is it easy for that man to live a secure and pleasant life, who by his conduct breaks through the common bonds of peace. Though he has the cunning to deceive both gods and men, his heart always trembles for fear of being discovered. For men often talk in their sleep, and are said to reveal things when they are delirious by a disease, and to bring to light their plots that had been long concealed. And now I show the cause that first dispersed the notions of the gods throughout the world, and filled the towns with altars, and ordered solemn rites to be performed, and holy ceremonies now in use, when victims smoked on every sacred fire. And when that fixed horror in the minds of men that builds new temples to the gods in every corner of the earth, and compels men to celebrate their festivals, it is not so hard a thing to show the cause. For men in the beginning of the world were used to see divine and glorious forms, even when awake, and in their sleep those images appeared in more majestic state and raised their wonder. And these they thought had sense. They fancied that they moved their limbs and spoke proud words, suitable to the grand appearance they showed, and to the mightiness of their strength. They ascribed eternity to them, because the constant stream of images incessantly came on, in form the same, that could not change, and then they could not die, because no power, they thought, could crush beings so strong in force, so large in size. And they thought them infinitely happy, because they were never vexed with the fears of death, and likewise in their dreams they saw them do things strange and wonderful with ease and without fatigue. Besides, they observed the motions of the heavens were regular and certain, that the various seasons of the year came orderly about, but could discover nothing of the causes of these revolutions, and therefore they had this resort. They ascribed everything to the power of the gods, and made everything depend on their will and command. The habitation and abode of these gods they placed in the heavens. For there they saw the sun and moon were rolled about. The moon, I say, they observed there, and the day and the night, and the stars serenely bright, and the blazing meteors wandering in the dark, the flying lightning, the clouds, the dew, the rain, the snow, the thunder, the hail, the dreadful noises, the threatenings and loud roarings of the sky. Unhappy race of men, to ascribe such events, to charge the gods with such distracted rage. What sorrows have they brought upon themselves? What miseries upon us? What floods of tears have they entailed upon our posterity? Nor can there be any piety for a wretch with his head veiled, to be ever turning himself about towards a stone, to creep to every altar, to throw himself flat upon the ground, to spread his arms before the shrines of the gods, to sprinkle the altars abundantly with the blood of beasts, and to heap vows upon vows. To look upon things with undisturbed mind, this is piety. For when we behold the celestial canopy of the great world, and the heavens spread over with the shining stars, when we reflect upon the courses of the sun and moon, then doubts that before lay quest under a load of other evils begin to awake and grow strong within us. What are the gods endued with so great power that can direct the various motions of all the bright luminaries above? For the ignorance of causes gives great uneasiness to the doubting mind of man, and hence we doubt whether the world had a beginning and shall ever have an end. How long the heavens, the walls of this world, shall be able to bear the fatigue of such mighty motion, or whether they are made eternal by the gods, and so shall forever roll on and despise the strong power of devouring age. Besides, what heart does not faint with the dread of the gods? Whose are the limbs that will not shrink when the scorched earth quakes with the horrible stroke of lightning, and the roaring thunder scores over the whole heavens? Do not the people and the nations shake, and proud tyrants, struck with fear of those avenging powers, tremble every limb, lest the dismal day come to punish them for the baseness of their crimes and the arrogance of their speeches?
Okay, thank you, Martin, for reading that today. We have been in our podcast going happily along through Book 5, talking about formations of worlds and animals and language last week, and now all of a sudden we just pop into some of the most important ethical aspects of Epicurean philosophy, it seems to me. And we've also been trying to do about 100 lines a week, and doing that fairly easily. But today there's so much packed into this, I'm not sure whether we'll get through all of what we have read today or not, but we'll certainly make a start of it. So if we go back to the very beginning, our opening today is, if men would govern their lives by the rule of true reason and live upon a little with an even mind, that would be the greatest riches. And that opens up one of our most ongoing and important discussions about the meaning of Epicurean philosophy and its ethics. And so to resolve that question for us, we'll turn to Don.
Boy, I find it interesting that he does. I mean, a lot of this that I see, he's getting directly from Epicurus, and he's paraphrasing various and sundry Vatican sayings and principal doctrines in here. And there's just, as you said, there's a lot packed into this small space.
Well, where we were last week, and this is probably a particularly good one to make sure we have continuity from week to week. In the lines beginning 1105, he had talked about the kings and how they began to build cities and found a citadel, and that they parceled out and gave flocks and fields to each man for his beauty or for his strength or understanding. But then he says, thereafter property was invented and gold found, which easily robbed the strong and beautiful of honor. For the most part, strong men are born, however beautiful their body, they follow the lead of the richer men. And so last week, that particular transition is important for us to have here this week, because he has opened up the discussion that what was perhaps a more natural order of strength and beauty and understanding among people became to be altered by the introduction of property and money.
Yep.
And so that's the context of this first sentence, where he says to live upon a little with an even mind would be the greatest riches. Now, so one of the ways we always ask that question is, does a statement like this mean that we should set our target for as little riches as we can possibly get by on?
Well, see, that's the thing. And one of the things that I think that you sort of implied there was that I always try and go back to what they actually say in the Latin. And the Latin word there for little or however it's paraphrased there, is parquet, which the definition, at least in Lewis and Short, is sparing in anything, especially in expenditure, in a good or a bad sense. And so some of the synonyms that he uses are frugal, thrifty, economical, but then also parsimonious and that sort of thing. So there can be both a good and bad sense there. So I think that, I mean, if he's just saying that we should live frugally and thriftily and economically and within our means, I don't think that is too controversial, at least from my personal perspective. But then I think some people take it to the extremes and say that, it's mandatory that you live on as little as possible and that sort of thing. And I don't think it necessarily means that. If we're looking at frugal and economical and thrifty and those sorts of synonyms seem like a positive way to put it to me.
Yeah, let's talk about that for just a little while. And Martin, let's turn over to you. Is it your practiced way of life to get by on as little as you can possibly get by on?
Only how to say this, partly. I mean, I eat a lot of porridge, so that one would mean it's pretty much live upon a little. No? But I also go out in restaurants and eat more expensive food. So it's just a mixture, no? So that I can live by porridge. I am happy enough to so that I like it. So that in principle I could live just on that one, just by taste. No? But of course I chose for fun and also to assure a more balanced nutrition, also to go for more luxurious meals. And I think this is pretty much what I think an Epicurean would do, no? As long as this luxurious type of food is still within our means and doesn't cause health problems.
I think that's a good way to put it. And I think that one of the things that seems to jump out to me is that at least once a month they had some sort of big celebration in the garden with the 20th and those sorts of events with all the other ones that Epicurus put in his will. So I mean, there were obviously times for celebration and feasting and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's my perspective as well. And we shouldn't go any further before we quote the applicable line from the letter to Menicius. And it is, and again, independence of desire we think a great good, not that we may at all times enjoy but a few things, but that if we do not possess many, we may enjoy the few, in the genuine persuasion that those have the sweetest pleasure in luxury who need it least, and that all that is natural is easy to be obtained, but that which is superfluous is hard.
So right there, what is he saying by superfluous? And I think that's where a lot of people bring in the idea of that, that anything other than the barest minimum to keep you alive is superfluous. And I don't think he's saying that at all.
Right. And another of the key texts to include in that discussion would be Vatican saying number 63, which Bailey translates as frugality too has a limit, and the man who disregards it is like him who errs through excess. So again, if that's a reliable quote from Epicurus, and I think it is, he's definitely not telling you to aim at the lowest possible as if you're trying to aim at asceticism, as if somehow the lowest possible is a goal in itself. I think we always have to keep in mind that the goal is, you can consider that to be just a logical application of it, or you can consider it however you like, but pleasure is what he always focuses on as the end. And if you put anything else like asceticism or frugality or parsimony or just living simply as the end, you've substituted something else for what Epicurus says, which is pleasure.
Exactly. Yeah, and I don't have a problem. I have source amnesia as far as where it's actually said, but I don't really have a problem with the idea of Epicurus experimenting with intermittent fasting or that sort of thing, and just to see how much it would take for him to find pleasure in something. I don't really have a problem with that, but I think that people take that idea and say that he did that all the time. Yeah. And of course, it's the bread and water in a pot of cheese, is so overdone that, I mean, I suppose we have to mention it, but it's like that doesn't necessarily mean he did that all the time.
I can't quote the full text of what you just said. That's one of the fragments, I think, but that's the one where he says that all he needs is bread and water and a bit of cheese to compete in happiness with Zeus, Isn't that
right.
what you're remembering? Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, I see that as one of those, whether you want to call it a thought experiment or just a reduction to the absurd, or just illustrating it by taking something to its logical conclusion, that, food is not what makes us happy. Food is not the only pleasure in life. And none of these things that we think about in terms of money or wealth or fame or anything is by any means the only thing in life.
Yeah, it looks like Seneca talks about the bread and water too in his letter. So Seneca is quoted as, the things which we actually need are free for all or else cheap. Nature craves only bread and water. No one is poor according to this standard. When a man has limited his desires within these bounds, he can challenge the happiness of Jove himself, as Epicurus says. So Seneca quotes him as saying that. And that, to me at least, that says that, yes, it's true that we can live on bread and water. And if we're alive, we can find pleasure in the, everyday things and all that kind of stuff. But it doesn't say that he lived on bread and water all the time. And I think that's something that you see all the time.
You see it when you say you see it all the time. You see it all the time in discussions.
Online and in discussions. And exactly. Yes.
That's almost everything that Epicurus has come to stand for in modern discussion, it seems like, is living simply and putting absence of pain as your greatest goal. And by doing that, you can basically, as long as you have a subsistence living, you're pursuing Epicurean philosophy, according to so many references you see on the internet. And we could spend the whole day talking about this issue and how all that plays itself out, but introducing it is maybe the best we can hope for today. We're doing a pretty good job of finding some of the key texts and at least making reference to them today. And one of them that we probably should also add, without going too far into the natural and necessary discussion, which is closely related to this, there is the section of Torquatus's narrative in On Ends, where he says this: nothing could be more useful or more conducive to well-being than Epicurus's doctrine as to the different classes of the desires. One kind he classified as both natural and necessary, a second as natural without being necessary, and a third as neither natural nor necessary. The principle of the classification, and this is the part that I think is significant, the principle of the classification being that the necessary desires are gratified with little trouble or expense. The natural desires also require but little, since nature's own riches, which suffice to content her, are both easily procured and limited in amount. But for the imaginary desires, no bound or limit can be discovered. And I guess the reason I cite that is I don't think he's laying down a hard and fast rule to tell us always to go for the bottom or the minimum. He's saying that when you look at any choice, you should evaluate how hard it's going to be to get it and what kind of pain is going to come from it and how much pleasure is going to come from it. And that principle of the classification is what you should look for, not looking for a bright line list that says always go for the smallest amount you can possibly get by on.
Exactly. Yep. I think that's a very good reference to have there. I was looking at the Greek anthology too, and there's a quote from Epicurus that's listed as, I revel in the pleasure of my humble body, employing water and bread, and I spit upon the pleasures of extravagance, not for their own sake, but because of the difficulties which follow from them. So it was all about how difficult it was to get something, how difficult it was to keep it, how difficult it was, and if we're talking about the desire for fame and the desire for, to have stuffed turducken, for supper every night, that's going to be a difficult thing to get. So I think that it comes back to how difficult it is to get and to maintain something is what he's looking at when he's talking about what things to choose.
Yeah, and even as we go through the next couple of paragraphs, I think we're going to see some more illustrations of that. I don't want to jump too far ahead right now, but we're going to talk about how he's really focusing to some extent his discussion on kings and them being deposed and slain and so forth. But then he either hints or explicitly states that the remedy for that was to establish laws and magistracies. So somebody's got to be a magistrate. Does even wanting to be a magistrate, is that too high a goal, or is that the equivalent of attempting to be a king? I don't think he's trying to say that everybody should just live as low as possible. He's saying they should live according to the circumstances so that they generate the most pleasure that they can for themselves at the least amount of pain. In other words, it's a scale. Go ahead, Don.
And that is an interesting idea, too, because, I mean, one of the things that I struggle with, too, is Epicurus saying that Epicureans should, take advantage of the stability of the government and not be involved in the government? Is he saying that as long as society is stable and has laws and has people to enforce those laws, that that it's okay not to take part in the government? Because I think we've had this discussion online too, that does the Epicurean just sit back and take advantage of the stable governments and the just kings and stuff like that, or do they actually take part in the political actions of the day?
Right. That's a very deep subject as well. My position being, of course, that I think he does take part, but only in a way that is rationally related to his calculation of what's going to bring him the most pleasure and the least pain. It's not something he can just say, I'm just never going to participate, or I'm always going to participate. He has to look rationally at the situation. There's some references in the biography by Diogenes Laertius, I think, that are relevant to what you just said there, in terms of one of the lines I'm looking at says he will pay court to a king if the occasion demands.
Right.
And then he will gather together a school, but never so as to become a popular leader. He will give lectures in public, but not unless asked. And I think there's one thing about that, he will be willing to take a matter to court as well. I don't see that as I'm looking through this list, but I think there's some material in some of the David Sedley commentaries I've seen as well, that there is a definite limit to how much of a distance Epicurus advised people to take, that they're clearly going to be circumstances in which you do need to inject yourself into the public sphere if it's necessary and appropriate for your future happiness.
And that brings up another section, or another common trope that I see with Epicurean discussions too, is the whole live unknown.
Right.
2 words that have just been, blown out of all proportion. And I think the ones that you read there sort of give that impression, that you don't want to insert yourself. You don't want to be a blowhard or just to get attention. But you have to decide where you're going to have the most impact and where your presence is going to be a benefit to yourself and society at large, it seems. Because you talked about, that you can start a school, but, don't make it a big production, and don't, just pull people into you just to pull people into you to blow yourself up, that sort of thing. Then you will give talks if asked. It's like, sure, I'll give a speech, but you aren't the first one to run in and say, let me talk.
Yeah. Well, why don't we spent the whole time talking about the first sentence so far. Why don't we go a little bit further? And let's see, the next sentence would be this little no man can fear to want, but men strive to be renowned and powerful, that their fortune may stand firm upon a lasting foundation, and the wealthy cannot fail to live at ease. Okay, that's another theme I wanted to sort of bring out today. As I read this material, especially when he's talking about kings and empires and so forth, I do have a sense that he is focusing on the highest level as clearly the part to evade the most, in terms of wanting to be a dictator or king or really one of the highest leaders of society. And to me, that doesn't necessarily rule out your more moderate involvement. I don't want to use the word moderate. I want to use the word your more limited, I guess, involvement.
I find it interesting that he talks about that the higher you go, the more likely you're going to be hit by a thunderbolt, metaphorically speaking. So, I mean, I think that what he's saying, too, is that the higher you go in government, the more unstable your position actually becomes.
Envy, like a thunderbolt, strikes them from the pinnacle of their glory and tumbles them down with scorn into an abyss of misery.
There you go.
And of course, in the next sentence here, in this translation, he says, so that it is much safer as a subject to obey than to wish for empire and to govern kingdoms. Well, I don't want to obey, but I don't want to wish for empire and govern kingdoms either, I want to live my life largely as I want to live it, and let other people live theirs as the way they wish to live it. And there's a section that I wish I could quote in actually one of the Platonic dialogues where one of the people takes that position, and I'm not going to be able to quote it today, but I don't think personally your only choice is to be an emperor or to live in a cave.
Right.
And that would be a false option to suggest that. But having said that, it's not illegitimate to make the observation that he's making here, that it's a whole lot safer to be living in your small house in the suburb and out of the big picture than it is to be a king or to go after pulling together the troops to put together an empire and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is all very important stuff. The next sentence I'm looking at, let those that will tire themselves in vain and spend their blood and their sweat in climbing the narrow track of ambition. For the highest of them all are blasted with envy as with a thunderbolt, and the higher they are, the more they are exposed.
Yep.
Since they depend wholly upon others for their wisdom and try things more by their ears than by their understanding. Well, ambition can be a dirty word in the world today, and I can understand why, but I don't think that translates into always just go for the minimum you can go for. I can't imagine that Epicurus thought that ambition as a concept, or at least as we understand it today, is always wrong.
I think it goes back to what does it take to get there? Because from what I'm seeing in the other sections too, it seems to be that he's saying, the unnecessary desires are the ones that you have to just strive and struggle with, and that you're not going with the flow, so to speak.
And saying that is helpful, but again, you have to parse down what does it mean to strive, and what does it mean, how much effort is okay. And maybe that's the point we need to be making at this particular point too, is I think the biggest error that people can make here is to think that there is a bright line, to think that there's an absolute standard and something that they can look. Certainly in Epicurean philosophy, you wouldn't look to God or to Platonic ideals or whatever. But I think today people think in those terms, and they think there's a magic answer for them as to what is necessary in life and what is not. And I think that if you read Epicurus as saying that there's a bright line, I think you can make a big mistake. Because again, suppose you've got a one-room cave and you decide you'd really like to have a two-room cave. Is that ambition? Is that necessarily wrong in Epicurean philosophy to wish for two rooms to your cave instead of one? Certainly Epicurus, as far as we know,
well, you'd have to,
I
think you'd have to say, why do you want your second room? Is it to keep up with the Joneses in the next cave over, and so they have one room, so you have two rooms? Or is it because you actually need the room for storage, or if your food is going bad, you need to have another room to put the storage in, to keep the food in, to keep it away from the cave bears and that sort of thing? So is there a good reason, or is there a vain reason to have your second room in your cave?
So you'd have to look at the reason and your motivation for it. I think you'd also have to look at what is the cost? What are you going to have to do to get it? Are two-room caves right next door very easy for you to find, and it's just a matter of you're moving over there? Or do you have to raise an army and go after and start conquering the village people or whatever in order to get it?
And I think that addresses the idea of living moderately or living economically, living within your means, because you have to see what are your personal means. I mean, do you have the money to do it? Then, and it's not going to hinder you in other parts of your life, then, go ahead and do it. If it's going to take all the money you have to build your second room in your cave, and that you're going to be penniless and you're going to be having a problem getting food afterwards, then that's probably not a good idea to add your second room on right now.
Well, so what if somebody comes to you, Don, and says, well, Don, what you've just said is very complicated. I don't know how to make that calculation in my own life. I came to you to give me the answer, Don. I came to you to teach me Epicurean philosophy so I would understand what the right answer was. Why aren't you giving me the right answer?
And you close the door and you say, have a nice day, and figure it out for yourself. That's the thing. I think you've hit on something there. I think Epicureanism is very much a philosophy of personal responsibility, because as you said, you can't point to a divine text. You can't point to the gods. You can't point to culture. It's all about how it affects you as an individual. Your own personal pleasure is something that you use to, and your own personal pain you use to calculate what would be the right path to go down.
As Rolf Humphreys would say, that's the way things are. I'm not saying it's a great thing. I can understand people being sad that there's no God to tell us what to do, or being upset that there's no formula that gives us an absolute rule, but that's the way the universe operates based on the elemental particles and void. That's just the way things are. There is no absolute answer to these things that suits everybody all the time, everywhere.
And I think that scares some people. I think that it's not easy. I mean, it's you have to, well, in some respects it is. I mean, if you listen to your own pain and pleasure and calculate your courses of action, based on that and looking forward and what this action is going to do for you in the future and what effect it's going to have on you, it can be very simple or you can make it very complicated.
This is probably part of that bitterness that Lucretius has talked about several times, that you need to rim the medicine cup with honey to get people to drink it down, because until they understand it, they can be repelled by the idea. It's so much easier to think that God will answer these questions for them, or that they can just go to a particular book and be told what to do. As Lucretius has mentioned here, it's much safer to obey than to wish for empire. So it would be safer if there were an absolute answer to be given to these questions, but it's just not there in the way the world operates. It's up to you to use your faculties and follow prudence and wisdom for the purposes of living happily.
I really have to go back. I've been trying to find the word that translates as obey in there, and just to see what the implications of that word are. So I will try and find that and post to the forum later on.
Right. I mean, that clearly is a subject that they talked about pretty regularly, was how to deal with the kings and dictators and so forth, and whether you should pay court to the kings or not. I think they had a lot of back and forth about whether it was correct for a philosopher to do that or not. Martin, we haven't heard much from you. I want to make sure that as far as ambition goes, how do you place the word ambition in context in Epicurean philosophy? What's good ambition versus bad ambition, or is all ambition bad, or how do you analyze that?
Ambition which supports our pleasure is actually what we need. I mean, we need something to drive us to do the things which we need to get the pleasure we're aiming at. And so that ambition to get to pleasure which I don't have when I'm just meditating in a cave, then this is certainly something to go for. No?
And so maybe we can move on after that comment there. But stating it that way is another example of the issue that I see so often in discussions of Epicurus on the internet, is that it is very easy to just say that ambition as a word, as a concept, is something that Epicurus denounced and said you should get rid of all your ambition. There's the quote about, I forget who he said it to, but he said to somebody that if you wish to, improve his life, reduce his desire. Do you remember the exact quote?
It was to him that Epicurus addressed the well-known saying, urging him to make Pythocles rich, but not rich in the vulgar and equivocal way. And then the quote is, if you wish, said he, to make Pythocles rich, do not add to his store of money, but subtract from his desires.
Okay, and it would be easy to take a passage like that and translate it into something that's just a flat rejection of all ambition. But I certainly don't think that would be a legitimate way of looking at it. And it's interesting that now that we brought that up, that's what I was forgetting, was what was the context in which he was saying it. Was he talking about just happiness? If you want to make him happy, reduce his desires. That would be, again, another situation to go looking at the original word. But you said rich. So it sounds like there's a possibility that he's talking about another context of money again.
And I think he's definitely using wealthy in the and I believe the fragment or the Vatican saying, if you want to be wealthy, Pythocles, don't increase your riches, but reduce your desires. And so I think he's using wealthy definitely in that first sense, in a metaphorical sense, because I think that's some of that clever wordplay that Epicurus can do in his writing, is that he will use one word to mean a couple different things. The one that I always like is the one where we're not compelled to live under compulsion. And uses like the same word like 3 times in different ways. So,
Well, let me try to move us past the first passage we have here for today. But before we go from the first passage, let me just once again, I like the last.
You're like Columbo. You're like Columbo. Just one more thing. Just one more thing.
One more thing on the very last in this Browne translation is kind of denouncing these people, because since they depend wholly upon others for their wisdom and try things more by their ears than by their understanding. Now, you could use that one for the many times when people talk about, the Epicureans just did exactly what Epicurus told them to do. They never used their own minds. They never disagreed with each other. They just simply accepted exactly what Epicurus said. But This is a pretty clear statement, presuming the translation is good, that you don't depend wholly upon others for your wisdom. And you don't just try things more by your ears than by your understanding. Wisdom and understanding are very important attributes of being a competent Epicurean to improve both of those things. I don't know, again, I hope that the Latin backs up what Browne says here, but this is the present case. It was always so and ever will be. That's almost like a biblical, this is the eternal state of mankind.
And the thing that struck me as Martin was reading that, and you bring it up again, the idea of the political figure, the politician who takes a survey, and whatever the survey says, that's what they say. And if another survey says something different a few days later, then they take that position. And so they're just waving in the wind with public opinion, and they don't use their own rational mind to sort of figure out the best course of action.
Yeah. Okay, well, now looking at the clock, I see that we're not even going to get past the first two passages here today in our discussion, so I'll put something in the podcast to break it up. If we go to the second passage, we now start talking about the interesting aspect of how the kings get slain. Then he talks about the very dregs of the people who enjoy bringing the mighty down, but how men got weary of living in a state of force and eventually of their own accord fell under the power of laws and the bonds of justice. Yep. And so there's a lot in there too, so I don't want to make too light of it. Don, you want to attack it?
Oh yeah, well, I think that he's definitely talking here about the formation of that idea of his natural justice, and that it's always a compact among community, and that there's nothing imposed by nature, because obviously he's talking about situations here where people were running amok and committing all kinds of crimes and that sort of thing, and that's why they had to finally decide that if they were going to continue to live as a community, they needed to come up with some sort of framework under which they all agreed that, okay, this is how we're going to conduct ourselves.
Martin, what do you think about this one?
I was checking some words, meaning of words. So let me see. Yeah, so this one is a bit, I'm still trying to figure this one out. So he is describing at the first part of the paragraph the overturning of a king. And then it seems he jumps to back how it happened. Long time before that, something like that was even like rule was established, no? But I'm not sure whether I see this right. Whether with and therefore the wisest and so on, he would go back in the past before the kings and explain how it happened that people would accept kings. No? Is that correct?
Now that you mention that, it does seem like he's going back and talking about where before the kings came along. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I wonder if there's a problem with one of the manuscripts that some sections got transposed, and that's how that they stayed. But I think you're absolutely right. It seems like they're going back and talking about before the kings came into power.
Okay, now I'm not entirely with you guys yet. I think we're talking about what's listed as paragraph 1136. Now, I certainly see where they're talking about deposing kings, but do you think that there's an implication that the use of laws and magistracies had been there before the kings, or the kings came first? I was thinking that the kings came first. I was thinking that the kings were sort of a logical extension of the individual local warlords or whatever, just the individual powerful people running around in small tribes became kings. I didn't see an implication that there were laws or magistracies before the kings. But you see that? You guys see that somewhere?
I think this is more, he looks at this more from a general perspective. So that means because kingdoms wouldn't start just from nothing. So you first needed to have organize a village, then organize an assembly of villages, and eventually it would be a big enough area that you could call it a kingdom. Huh? And so it's something had to happen first at the basic community level, and I think it's really going back to that level. Because in most of the cases, the effect of the revolution is that the old king is dead and the new king takes over the power. So that means it just then the succession between the kings. And what he's talking there is really something different now with the magistracy.
Now, this may be, again, an interesting difference in perspective based on Martin's Germanness and his, what I would perceive as the cooperativeness and get along with each other background that maybe is more Germanic than is like in the United States. I'm thinking of like little robber barons, or what would you describe it, Don? If you're following the idea that humans are first forming themselves into small little tribes tribes and so forth. I'm thinking that the earlier form of organization would be just the strongest man of the tribe exerting his will over the local people around him, which essentially makes him a little kind of local king or local dictator as the first thing that would occur. So straighten me out, Don. What's going on?
No, it just seemed like we were talking about the formation of laws and things like that like a little while ago, like a couple sessions ago.
Yeah,
and now we're again talking about the same thing.
Now that I agree with, that there might be some back and forth in the text here. But in just looking at this passage separately, I think I heard Martin saying that he's talking about within this passage, society might have originated. And that's what Martin said a moment ago, is that, certain types of people, you were talking last week or the week before, Martin, about a more communal or community oriented type culture, like perhaps is in Africa. I remember you using that example. I guess you could see some societies just going immediately into a local law agreement type of arrangement. But I'm thinking that there are also going to be societies where you're just going to basically have the rule of force by the strongest of the local people, and he's not going to care about what other people think. Maybe you wouldn't call that a society then. I don't know. But,
and that definitely seems what he's talking against. He's not talking about, because the one line here is, for this reason, men grew sick of a life of brute force. So he's definitely looking at getting some laws in place and not might makes right necessarily.
I mean, if you look back of what scarce is, what is known about the ancient Germanic tribes. So there, it was a mutual thing. It was not that the leader of the tribe would just be something like a powerful guy imposing his power. It was the other way around, that the people chose him because he was the strongest or the best leader, or he was the one who was lucky in leading people. He had luck when he was leading troops in an unavoidable fight. So that they basically swore allegiance to him because they expected him to protect the community in the best way possible. So, and they would then help him because he knew he could organize them in the way that they could defeat enemies. So it was more like this mutual thing. And if a king or the leader, then typically he wouldn't even be called as a king by those ancient German tribes typically. And so that if he was no more lucky, then one ambitious guy could easily push him away. So and that new ruler would then be accepted normally easily because he showed that he had the fortune to take over.
Exactly. So you're saying that if somebody seemed to be able to lead the community and to get things done, and that the tribe was in a better spot than they were with the old guy, they would accept the new guy because, hey, we're in a better situation now.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. As I read, it was pointed out that it was highly unusual that one leader, after an injury, was limping. And normally, if the leader was limping, he was immediately replaced because that meant he had lost his fortune, the ability to win. And but there was one leader who was so well regarded that despite him being then eventually limping, he could still keep being the leader.
Yep.
But it was pointed out that this was an exception. That was not the rule. Normally, if the leader was limping or in any way badly affected, that would be the pretext that the next guy in line would push him aside.
Yeah.
Well, I think we got off on this discussion because we're talking a little bit about just what this might say as to whether there was any issue of sequence. In fact, I think what I remember is that Martin was trying to process whether there was an implication that you would go from kings back to an earlier type of order. And I don't want to introduce another set of factors, but almost certainly you'd have to think about what Lucretius was thinking of through the Roman example, because I've always thought there was some ambiguity in the story of Romulus and Remus versus the formation of the Roman Republic with the deposing of the Tarquinian kings. You've got to probably factor that into something that these people would have been thinking about, since he was a Roman writing to another Roman.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that, because the kings came first in Roman history, and then the Republic came of that. So, if you put it that way, I guess that does seem that that's what this paragraph could possibly be referring back to as well. Because if the kings were deposed, and then so there was some disorder after the kings, and then they decided to try and draw up some codes and laws, and then that's where the Republic came from. So you're having brought that up, then I can see that as a parallel to this paragraph then, I guess.
It doesn't really match, because these kings were not Roman kings. They were from another people which ruled over the Romans at that time. So basically, by deposing those kings, they also then got rid of the rule of that other people above them. So it was more a liberation for the Romans. So it doesn't really fit into this one. I really think this refers to there's a jump in the paragraph going from toppling a king to long before kingdoms were established, how society came to get organized. Because if we look also at the history around the time of Lucretius, then already the emperor had been established, no? And this would not go away. It would not replace this by something else. It's just that another emperor would take over.
As we begin to think about bringing today to an end, I would say that probably the second passage we ought to bring back to the issue of, again, whether there's a bright line or not, because the line I focus my eyes on right now, therefore the wisest among them taught the rest to settle a magistracy and to establish laws by which they would be governed. I think when he says that the wisest among them taught that is certainly an approving attitude towards what happened. And that doesn't mean that they all retreated back to live in their own individual caves. They set up a legal system. They set up magistracies. Right. Somebody has to be the magistrate. And I don't think it's wrong under the Epicurean picture to wish to be a magistrate or to wish to have a legal system. And you could say that that is ambitious as well.
And I think that it's important to note that the Epicureans would prefer a stable, just society in which to live, because then that makes it easier to pursue your own pleasure.
And I would say to that, of course, that's the right answer. The idea that these people out there on the internet will say that Epicurus says to go live in a cave, never participate in government, that is the stupidest thing I can possibly think of. And I have a feeling if Epicurus were here to say that, he would be as upset about it as I would be right now in my kind of caricature of the question, because it is so ridiculously short-sighted to think that you have the ability to retreat into a cave and live by yourself and just never have the problems that intrude from the outside world affect your life. If you don't watch what's going on, participate as necessary in order to maintain your circumstances in that kind of steady state that you'd like them to be in, then you're not going to live as happily as you could otherwise. There's no guarantee that you're going to be successful in managing those circumstances, so there's always the possibility that you're not going to succeed and that you'll get in a war and be taken down unjustly by criminals or something like that. But if you don't use some degree of observation and some degree of prudence to evaluate your circumstances and adjust to them, then to me, if I were Epicurus and I heard somebody suggesting that I had a bright line view of living in a cave, I would slap them in the face.
Yeah, you have to go back to, the whole idea of the live unknown thing that people take sometimes, living solitarily and living by yourself and not being involved just doesn't make any sense in the whole context of, the school was founded in a garden and he welcomed people into the group. And so there was a whole group ethic in being part of a community of Epicureans that doesn't make any sense if you try and extrapolate to, living a solitary life somewhere. It's like that was never a part of the philosophy.
Right. I think this probably is a good point for us to begin to draw today's discussion to a conclusion. So, Martin, what final thoughts for today? Since we've gotten maybe 20% of the way into the text that we were supposed to get into today, but it's still been an important and I think good discussion. So, Martin, do you have any summary thoughts for today?
No, I've said everything. I'm fine.
All right. Well, Don.
I will look forward to talking about the gods next week.
That's right. We're basically continuing this thought and taking a couple of variations of it. But next week, if we keep it this rate, we'll take 3 weeks before we get through these passages we set out for today. But this is some really interesting stuff that I think has general interest among the people who follow Epicurus and Lucretius. So we'll try to give it the attention that it deserves. And with that, maybe we should close for today and come back next week. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.